this computer.
I'll go get them now and then it's done.
And there's the little red dot, so we're good to go.
I'll look at this.
Okay,
All yours. Okay.
now recording for posterity.
What a good thing.
Yes.
It's organised. Yeah. Good to go. And your day, Chris? Did you get your water?
Have you been to London before?
Yes.
Lovely, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I was going to suggest that.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to table the
Fantastic.
the locking?
I mean,
Do that.
Yes.
No. Oh well. Yeah. Probably yes. I use frequency, so it's on the orchestra play here.
I might have bought them here once when I was at university. I think I'm looking around and I
anything
see this baby familiar.
I think it will
anything. It used to be on the order.
is the
You probably remember.
how's that time?
Paul Gordon was here and he was saying, look, the first time he'd been in since it's been done, he remembered the queue for Greece. Out, around the corner and down the street.
I might have there was some my friend's own friend, Elder's
I'm not sure whether that's
Long-legged Brenda.
and with lots of red hair, yeah, and she used to work. I think it's there was one movie that was so big and busy that I had to work as well. It wasn't very good at it though. It wasn't right together. So. But it's taken me a long time to work out that the toilets aren't just under the stairs. Because that's where they were. Yes, I'm thinking it's a good thing.
Never mind.
We used to only go upstairs because we weren't allowed downstairs. Okay, 5 to 8. 5 to 8. And this is not very well.
your masterpiece.
There's a second copy there if you just want to push it here. Sorry, Gary. Tony. Let me see, just write out something.
No, it was a sudden. It's really, really heavy. It was no rain, and then when I got to the carriage.
5 to 8.
It's a magnificent. We could flip through it for you, but that's all right. Looking elsewhere. Okay. What's the time, Shelley, please? 5:10. Okay. I think I'll get my presentation over. Sam, are you happy with that?
Yeah.
You wouldn't cry if somebody misses it? Okay. Janine and Andy, I'm going to do my presentation, get that out of the way, because people have heard my voice before here, and some of them have read my opinions, including on STV, more than once. And that way we'll get to the interesting stuff. So, stating the bleeding obvious, what we're here for, but just mentioning the one of the other strings to Matarangi Action's bow, which is having revived the Matarangi Regatta and having a ongoing roll with its organisation. These, how many years later? 74? 45? 45 years. Okay. And I could have quickly added David in there, but I'm sure that you go all like a coat. And yeah, so far apologies from Clooney, and I mentioned Clooney's question. So I'm going to attempt to answer Clooney's question in a whole lot less time than 5 minutes. So starting now, are you telling me, Dave? Okay. So starting now, the last or previous local body elections, our President Tessa Burgess stood for the local board, and she was easily elected, had the almost the greatest number of votes, second only to Alison Rowe, who in some circles, a household name, did awfully well despite it being first past the post. Meantime, this last election, Ayla Walker stood with Tessa's support so that there would be a young candidate, but due to minimal name recognition, sharing a billboard with two others, we didn't have the hot souvenir billboard story that accompanied Tessa. When Tessa's billboards started to disappear, we handled that as a compliment, and the mainstream media picked that up, and that was very useful bit of publicity. But in Ayla's case, she didn't get close to being elected under first past the post, but nor would her supporters have realised that they were also voting against her by voting for the candidates that were going to be easily re-elected. So, time, Dad?
On minute 43.
Oh, okay. Well, that's longer than I'd planned, but there we go. So, my approach to the whole business of turnout is that we've got to see it in the context of the global decline in turnout, and that means that the odd local fix is unlikely to address that by itself. One of the things we know works as far as turnout is concerned is having children vote in schools. Auckland City Council back in the day started a kids voting program, and people in the Auckland area, children in the Auckland area, are exposed to this at about twice the rate of kids nationwide, but it's still only a small fraction of children that are involved in this program. And yet every election we have, councils come up with their very clever idea of how they're going to single-handedly reverse the global decline in voter turnout, and of course it doesn't work. The other aspect regarding STV is that in countries such as the United Kingdom that are plagued by their or blighted by their first past the post system, are in a different position than we are in New Zealand as far as promoting STV, because in Britain it's needed, or something is needed, to replace first past the post for general elections as well as local elections. And I included one of the fathers of Māori representation in New Zealand, one of the more salubrious in that story, and I loved his quote about it being flawed to expect men to respect the law who don't enjoy it. The British election, start with our last election, where National earned 44% of the votes and gained 47% of the seats, in contrast with the one that Boris has just led, where the Conservatives got the same 44%, but got 56% of the seats. But that landslide is just one of the landslides that we need to be worrying about, and my concern is that democracy is failing right at the time it's needed most. And making the point, of course, that Donald Trump was supported by only a quarter of voting age Americans, but he's been able to pull the US out of the Paris Agreement nevertheless. And the fact that he didn't even outperform Hillary Clinton, except in the Electoral College. Finishing up, ranked choice voting, STV, fairest, it's consistent, or we need consistency in our voting. Switching from ticking to ranking is fraught. Made that mistake myself first time round, and it's only very rarely unnecessary to not use ranked choice, and our party vote is an example of that. On the face of it, it provides proportionality, but not so much for the minor parties, and the people supporting or of a mind to support a local party shouldn't risk having their vote wasted simply because it didn't make the threshold, whether it's 5%, 4%, or Stephen Todd's brilliant one in between. I believe we need a campaign that has MMP front and centre with the promotion of STV. Otherwise, there's going to be confusion as to whether this is about replacing STV. And I think that would be both unproductive but also a retrograde step, because MMP done right provides much better proportionality. Why did I put this in this particular bit? But yes, you can vote using STV till 7 p.m. this evening, everybody that hasn't voted already, for the first mayor of Matarangi. Ayla's not here yet to defend herself. She's trying to ensure that I receive more votes. We're campaigning for each other in the hope of not being elected. So by way of introduction, Janine, the spin-off article that alerted me to your good work was Hayden Connell. Yeah, and I did email him in the hope that he might participate, But you did. Thank you so very much. And I was wondering, far too close to the to this event to be doing such things, about what your introduction might be, and I decided that your response to email response to me was beautiful, and that I'd use that. And you said, "Hello, Chimino. Thanks so much for your email. I would be delighted to join the December event if I can. Stephen Todd has been a huge support for me over the years as I try to make inroads in a mandatory change to STV. I'm getting more media requests than ever in the lead up to these elections, and I turn the topic to electoral reform regardless of the question," which I thought was beautiful.
That's the way to do it.
Yeah. Thanks for getting in touch, and I enjoyed your 17 August discussion. I will use those Auckland Council figures when I talk to BFM on Monday. So that's about the nicest thing anybody's ever said to me. I look forward to hearing from you in December, Janine. So, Janine, over to you. And hopefully that'll close that, and we can.
Yes.
You can drive from there, Jason.
Go. Oop. Screen sharing has stopped, and it can be spotlight video.
Yes.
There we go.
Excellent. Well, I hope you can hear me well enough. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you this morning. I think these kinds of events are probably the most important things that we do, because it's that word of mouth and community engagement that's completely essential for getting any kind of change to occur. So I'm really delighted involved in this event. Thank you so much. And I've been really interested to follow the magazine and your comments and everything else. And hello to the other people who are here to talk about these issues. So is the sound quality all right if I talk for a few minutes?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So I think it's nice to have a discussion. So I'll be relatively brief, but I did want to raise three points, really. And the first, I guess, is to start where Chimino left off and just reflecting on our recent elections. I definitely felt like this election I had many more media requests about STV than I had before. So I do feel like there is a bit of a swell of kind of public discontent about the shape and form of our councils, and people are increasingly looking for solutions to that. And I thought some of the articles that were done about STV were really excellent, and I think the one that you used as the example is a really good example of it. I think it spoke very clearly to people about how ridiculous it is to still be using first past posts in so many of our council elections. So Dunedin has used this. I'm at Wagga, and Dunedin's used STV since 2004. And I've been doing voter education, really, to try and help people feel confident about using STV. And they do, really. I get frustrated with people saying that STV is too complicated, because Dunedin folk, aren't fazed by it at all. And in fact, they are getting increasingly strategic in the way that they are engaging with STV. And I think a really good example of that is our students, who, because of Dunedin's demographic, the students make up a large proportion of our population. And they are, in the last three elections, they've been building a really good campaign to try and get a student or two elected on the council. And they're doing that precisely because of STV, because they realise, can you still hear me? That, the system will allow for somebody from their demographic to be elected. So probably last election was their most effective, sorry, not the one we've just had, but 2016. They managed to boost the vote, the youth vote, by about 2.5%, which was really exciting with the campaign that they ran on campus. And got very, very close to having their student representative elected. Sadly, she just dropped out on the final iteration when the final councillor was elected. But you really came very close, and that gave them a great boost. So I think STV is really well bedded in Dunedin, although I'll say something more about that in a moment in terms of how precarious it is for all councils who are using STV anyway. I think that the first past the post mindset, I think, is still quite pervasive. I mean, we still see this in MMP elections as well. Every election raises a new challenge for us. We learn something new about MMP each election, and that always has a little bit of a first past the post backlash as people hark back to days where they think things were a bit simpler. I think the FPP mindset is still pretty solidly entrenched in local council politics, which can be quite frustrating. But I think certainly in Dunedin, with how long we've been using STV now, that is beginning to shift. I think the really good news, though, is that nationally there are more people voting using STV now than ever before in local council elections. We don't have a huge number of councils using the system, but we've got a few big councils now who have picked it up. And my hope is I'm going to have a real crack at Christchurch for the next round and see if I can get them to try and engage with the issue more significantly, and see if we can just, I think 1 or 2 more large councils changing would make a real difference. But I think thinking about the STV in the future, I think raises a really important question. I had, for a number of years, when I was invited to talk to councils about making that choice between first past the post and STV, I was fairly kind of painstakingly neutral about the issue and would talk to them about how the two systems worked. I gave up on that probably 1 or 2 election cycles ago, because frankly the evidence is just so overwhelming that it's a fairer, in the way that I think fairness looks, electoral system, that I now simply advocate quite strongly for it when I'm talking with councils. But I think it's just ridiculous that we are, every community is having to, through its own discussions, on its own terms, in its own way, at its own expense, and with great time and engagement by people trying to work this issue out. So really, I think the way forward is for central government to champion the issue. I think the closest hope that we have for something like that to occur has been the Green Party, but again, their policy is to make a community poll compulsory rather than have mandatory change to STV. And again, I think we live possibly with the false impression that electoral change is easy to do because of the way that we changed our electoral system in '93. And it really isn't. I mean, we were remarkable doing that, and I think it's unrealistic to expect communities to make changes themselves. So I'm hoping that at some point central government will simply make a mandatory change. I think really that's going to save us an awful lot of time, and communities an awful lot of spent energy. I've certainly had, leading into the last election, I had more inquiries than ever before also from various councils or community members in different constituencies wanting to know how they could try and get a successful poll up and change the electoral system. And you do what you can to offer advice, but I know that it's probably not. It's a really difficult task. So, but as I said, I think the good news is that there are more people now voting using STV than ever before, and that has to be a good thing in terms of getting a little bit more noise around the issue at each election. I think to stepping back and having a look at those in terms of the graphs that we were looking at earlier in the presentation, there is a real concern about that decline in democracy. And the reports about the UK election I think the thing that made me most concerned were the discussions about, from the exit polls, who the Labour Party had lost in its support, that a lot of those traditional Labour voters appear to have abandoned the party, a lot of the working class vote. And I guess my concern is, where does that vote go now in a first past the post system? I think what is concerning most about the position that democracy is in is the gap in that inequality in marginalised groups who are becoming very disillusioned with democratic systems. And I think that's where you start to see those votes go in dangerous directions as a kind of a protest against what people see happening. I think New Zealand, I mean, I don't think fortunate's the right word. I think we had the foresight to know that there was something wrong with the way that we were doing our elections in the 70s and 80s. And thankfully we now have that proportional system, which acts, as so many people say, as a good kind of safety valve for us to try and keep things aligned with how people are actually voting. But I think stepping back from STV specifically, there are a number of other initiatives that we need to seriously consider, and some of them are being debated in various ways. There's the idea about lowering the voting age to 16, which, when I talk with my students about it, is spectacularly unpopular with young people. I think it's probably because they themselves, if they're of voting age, which most of them are when I see them, when they're 18, they don't want their little brother or sister getting the vote earlier than they did. So it's not a popular suggestion with young people, but I think it is a good debate to be having. And I think that's partly because it links to that idea that we saw with the Auckland voting in schools, that schools, we know that voting is quite a group and social process, and schools could play an incredibly valuable role in making that, so, socialising that experience of voting for the first time for those who are fortunate enough to be 16 in the point in the electoral cycle that they're able to vote while they're at school. The civics education in school is another thing that the Political Science Professional Group Association is working really hard on with the Ministry of Education to see what can be done to try and cement some of that civics education into the curriculum. And we're certainly making much more progress with the current government than we had with other governments. And of course, the other issue, Andy will have plenty to say, I'm sure, if he gets onto it, about the e or online voting, but also the idea about compulsory voting. And again, that tends to divide people's opinions, but it is most certainly something that's worth considering, because it does help to close that policy gap. Governments have to think about all voters if compulsory voting's used, rather than just making policy for those who vote. So those are my thoughts to open things out. And I think now I believe I'll hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Andy Asquith from Massey University, from School of Management, who can add his thoughts to the mix.
Thank you, Jane. I've never had such a prestigious opening act for me. Thank you. Crikey, where do I start? I suppose I start as, to quote the headline in the Manawatu Standard, a failed candidate in this year's local body elections. I should frame the headline failed candidate. I stood, as some of you may know, for the mayoralty in Palmerston North this year, and also for council as well. And I was driven, I suppose, by two things. The first one was the idea that elections are meant to be contested, and the mayor was not going to be challenged in Palmerston North. And I was also motivated by the fact that we use STV here. In the first past the post system, I sort of worked on the assumption that I'd be dead in the water before I started, but with STV, it's a whole different ballgame. I've been a fan of proportional systems since way back in 1983, when Janine mentioned, and so did Semino, the election in the UK last week. Well, in 1983, Margaret Thatcher won an even bigger majority with an even smaller proportion of the vote. And that set me thinking. And the more I've looked at STV since I've been in New Zealand, the more I've become a fan. And having your arm twisted at your back by Janine a couple of times sort of helps you come to that point of view. But I've been increasingly distressed by watching elections in the UK on a first past the post system, where governments of so-called left and right have racked up huge majorities with declining proportions of the popular vote. And we've just got to look around the world today, and we see a number of countries where you have so-called populist leaders who are elected by smaller and smaller groups of the total populace. And that, to me, reflects sort of grave dangers to us all. But if I can turn back to New Zealand and Palmerston North, the election in Palmerston was an interesting exercise. And as I already said, I'm a failed candidate, but the outcome of the election was very interesting in the sense that despite the fact that we had a contested election, turnout declined, and reference had already been made to declining turnouts. In the post-mortem after the election, it was interesting. The initial comment from the mayor was that turnout had declined as a result of people being satisfied with what the council had been doing. But more recently, he argued that turnout had declined because STV was confusing voters. Now, what's particularly interesting about that comment is that last week I read the submission that Palmerston North City Council made to a select committee inquiry that published a report last week. And in its submission to the select committee, the City Council just made two suggestions. The first one was that STV should be mandatory for all local body elections, which I would wholeheartedly support. And secondly, something that Janine alluded to, was they argued that online voting should be utilised. If we go back to the issue of declining turnout in local body elections, and the argument that it's declining because people aren't satisfied, well, that just doesn't hold up. I've seen no evidence whatsoever, and I don't know of any of my colleagues that study local government that have found any evidence that supports this argument. The hard evidence would suggest that people don't vote in local elections because they don't know who they're voting for or why they're voting. So the argument that online voting will cure all these unknowns is a mystery to me. If you dig down into some of the work that's been done on online voting, then you'll see that there are all sorts of issues around security, around transparency. No one yet tries to tackle the key issue of engagement. And if we don't engage people and encourage them to vote by demonstrating the importance of voting, then we're never going to get there. And it's a real worry. The Economist Intelligence Unit produces a report every year that's like an audit of global democracy. And they rank 185 countries in terms of their level of democraticness, if that's a word. And there are only 18 countries that are ranked as true full democracies, and we're one of them. And we should be celebrating this, and we should be using STV to a certain extent to try and promote this and to embed the values that we cherish here in New Zealand. I think these are very important points that that we need to hold dear in the somewhat turbulent world in which we exist. That I think I will hand over to David, who I haven't seen for a long time. David, how are you?
I'm very good, thanks, Andy. Good to see you again. I've been unmuted now.
You are unmuted, yes.
Yes, well, I was, initially a big fan of MMP when we were having the referendums back in the early 90s. Because ironically, it was a first past the post election for a proportional, whether we wanted to go to a proportional system. And, the politics were then that if you didn't back MMP, we wouldn't have got proportional representation in any way, shape or form, because that was the Royal Commission's recommendation. So it was important to support that. Since then, however, I have been involved in politics. In the Green Party, I've stood for Parliament twice and once for the mayoralty of Auckland independently. And I have an observation to make about, I guess, the political sociology of MMP. And the issue there is, if you want to get a high list ranking and get into Parliament, then of course you need to campaign within your party to get that list ranking. In the Greens, that means marshalling support from various internal constituencies, because they do have actually a method of voting, list ranking their candidates. In other parties, I'm nominally a member of TOP at the moment, really it's a matter of brown-nosing the board in order to get a good list ranking. And there's a couple of sort of, the Labour Party and the National Party sit in between those two extremes. But the thing about STV, I think, is it requires candidates to be outwardly focused. You actually have to address your issues and concerns and sell your party's policies to the electorate in order to get elected into Parliament. I think that is a far healthier approach to democracy, generally speaking, that the party is outwardly rather than internally focused. So, you know, I've switched my allegiance quite strongly to the idea that we should have STV. Having stood in local body elections, then, you know, the issue that's really kind of testing my patience is that we have 3 different voting systems in play at the moment. If you're voting on one ballot, your local body ballot paper for the District Health Board, you're using STV because that's written into the Health Act, New Zealand Disability, you know, Health and Disability Services Act, whatever. When they passed the Act, they just said elections for DHBs will be by single transferable vote. Well, end of story. Most local governments, as Janine has pointed out, are stuck with first past the post because the process in the local electoral act for changing your voting system is so, you know, onerous and complicated. And certainly in Auckland, the idea that you could get a certain proportion of the entire Auckland electorate to sign a petition in order to push for STV is bizarre in the extreme. And there's no good reason really not to do what they did with the Health Act and just say it's STV. And then at least on the one ballot paper, you've got the same voting system for both elections. And I believe that that should be applied at national level as well. Democracy, in my experience, is something that people have to learn, they have to be trained in, they have to grow to understand in order to appreciate the value of it and to engage with it. We don't teach civics in high school. We don't, you know, in New Zealand, we don't make that effort in a consistent and systematic way. One of the ways that we could make democracy more attractive is to make it simpler. And using just one voting system in all government elections, be they local, central or whatever, would certainly make it easier for people to grasp what democracy means to them and how they can be involved. And finally, I guess my pitch for STV is, so at the moment I'm at the Auckland Kindergarten Association, which is actually a very large organisation. We run 107 kindergartens around Auckland and have revenues over $60 million a year. And I've been working on a review of our constitution, which the annual general meeting just passed, and for the first time ever we are going to elect a teacher onto the board of directors. And I have persuaded the management team that we will use preferential ballot, which is a single person version of STV, for the sole reason that we want the first teacher on the board to have a clear mandate from the majority of teachers. We can't afford to elect a teacher director for the first time who's only supported by 25, 30 or 40% of the teachers. That's going to be seen as a failure of our process. So we're using preferential ballot, and we are using online voting. Because we have 600 teachers, including our relieving teachers, across the Auckland region, and to do it by any other means would just take too long and involve too much administration. So we're using an online voting system called Election Buddy. There are a number of them that we've reviewed. This has a very nice interface for STV. We just upload a bunch of email addresses and unique ID codes for each teacher into the system, load the nominees into the system with their photos and a short statement and the name, obviously. And then on the day that voting starts, you press the button and it sends out an email with a secure link to the voting page. And then people can rank just by choosing a number. And when the election closes on a Friday afternoon, we will have results of that vote immediately, because the computer has handled all the mathematics in the background. And so for us, that was just, at a cost of maybe 250 New Zealand dollars, the simplest, easiest, fastest and most appealing way of running that election. And it does, because they're running this system and testing the software and working out the issues, then they have got the secure connections going, they've got auditable results, and a method of preserving secret voting, but also being able to demonstrate that only the right people voted and only voted once. So we're quite pleased with that, and that's a big move forward. But I really think for New Zealand, the challenge really is, to push for STV at local body first. I think so. There's familiarity with the system and how it works. It's already there on that ballot paper. It just needs to be on the other side of the ballot paper, and then go from there towards the national elections.
Right. Okay. Any questions, either of the panelists or by the panelists, or from? Yes, that covers both, doesn't it? Gary?
Come on, Gary, we're looking at you.
Using the Boris Johnson.
Now, can you hear Gary there? Do you want to just jump in behind?
That's fine. I can.
You can hear me? Okay, that's good. It's a bit like Siri must be listening to us.
Yeah.
Okay. The talk we all have about the system, I think, is actually pertinent. So if you've got a low voter turnout because A, people don't understand, or B, they don't think their vote actually makes a difference. In other words, none of the candidates are actually any good. This is probably an argument. Or B, even if the candidates are really good, they're not effective. How much does a voting system contribute to that? In other words, I can certainly see STV as being a more accurate voting system, but it's an unknown one from our point of view. And I think your comment about MMP earlier, I think, is actually quite like to explore that. We all discover new things and new nuances in the voting system. What's the chances of a new nuance, or what's the kind of things that STV could bring out in terms of candidate behaviour that could be different to our current systems?
Yeah, I think we've seen that in Australia, where they've been using it for quite some time, that candidates will encourage voters to vote strategically, not just a ticket, but sort of instruct them, if you support me, then distribute your preferences this way. So, if I don't get in, then you should vote for so-and-so. And that's, so there will be consequences in terms of strategic behaviour, I think, but I think the most important thing, in my mind, is that candidates are directing their attention towards voters and towards voters' interests and engaging in that conversation with them, which is because of the political party system in New Zealand is less controlled. And I have to say, looking at the UK and the US elections, the sort of toxic partisanship, especially in the USA, that's being exhibited there, is one of the things that's destroying democracy in that country at the moment. And I'm starting to increasingly think that political parties are the problem. And any voting system that has the potential to take some power away from the parties and make them work harder and more fairly would be a good thing.
That's interesting there, because one of my views here is that parties in local body elections can actually engage and enhance the quality and viability of the electoral process. We published some work earlier this year using data from Auckland that demonstrated that when party politics are involved, then in local elections, then that tends to garner people's support, because if candidates just stand as independent, which most local body candidates do, then it's very difficult to put a sheet of paper between any two candidates. But when they identify with a party identifier, then it's much easier for people to know what candidates stand for. But I think here there's a much deeper concern. Janine talked about the excellent work that NZPSA has been doing in terms of trying to get civics taught in schools. But the much bigger picture that we haven't mentioned yet is the need to educate older people. It's now nearly 10 years since the Local Government Commission published work that showed that young people, if they don't vote in either of the first two elections that they can do after their 18th birthday, then they'll never vote. So we need to have a concerted campaign for educating the population at large about the importance of Democracy 101. This is going to be a long-term project, probably 10, 15, even 20 years before we get the idea that voting is a civic responsibility and duty instilled into people. And I would accompany that after, say, 15 years or so by making voting compulsory. I think this is an important thing. And advocates of online voting quite often cite New South Wales as an example of online voting working, because turnout is much higher, it is argued, in New South Wales. But they forget the fundamental fact that in federal elections in Australia, voting is compulsory. So voting is part of the psyche in Australia, where here in New Zealand it's not. And the final point that I would just like to pick up on, I think Janine mentioned about lowering the voting age. I think it's Norway where 60-year-olds can vote in local body elections and 18 in general elections. So the idea is you sort of get them schooled into the idea of voting and taking part in a democracy when they're 16, so that when they're 18, they're all geared up to go and participate in a national political election.
Yeah, I would agree with you that I don't think online voting is in any way useful for increasing voter turnout. I mean, from the point of view, our point of view at the Kindergarten Association, it was just a whole lot simpler and faster and cheaper than doing a mass mail out and then counting physical votes when they came back in, if they came back in. So the technology makes life easier for the electoral officer, but I don't think it's appealing to the electorate in that way. I agree with the comment that you made earlier that the issues and we've seen that in Auckland numerous times. If there's a big issue like the first super city election or the big stoush that we had about a motorway across Hobson Bay 10, 15 years ago, is making getting a lot of attention in the media, then voter turnout will increase. It's as simple as that. If it's a lacklustre election with no big issues and no attractive candidates, turnout goes down.
Well, I'm offended by that, bearing in mind that I was a candidate in Palmerston North and turnout did go down.
Yeah. And
What are you saying?
regards to your comment on political, he says quickly changing the subject. Gough, stood as an independent twice and won, which was just, everybody knows that he's the Labor Party guy. It's absurd to pretend that he's standing as an independent. So the tickets across Auckland are quite heavily politically weighted, and I think everybody knows that. What has been interesting for me is that the City Vision ticket, which used to be the old Auckland City Council boundary areas, just the electorates on the isthmus, main isthmus, has never shown any ambition to move beyond its traditional boundaries after the super city was created. They haven't extended out into the west, onto the North Shore or to the east. The Labor Party runs South Auckland and wins most of the seats and runs as Labor down there. When I was in the Greens, I was quite strongly advocating that the Greens should run a Green Party branded ticket across Auckland. But they didn't want to offend Labor and didn't want to take on the challenge of contesting citizens and residents, which is the National Party /ACT. But then, so that was about 2011, I think, 2010 local body elections. But they did that in Wellington under James Shaw's leadership and got a clean sweep. Every candidate they put up got in. And they ran a good, strong, green-branded campaign. So, the attitude of the major parties to campaigning in local body elections is a little bit sort of, I don't know how to describe it, actually. Gutless. Inconsistent.
I think the thing that I've observed in Dunedin about STV campaigning is how much less adversarial it needs to be. Our candidates tend to group together to campaign, and they will have billboards that they share with others, as you see in other STV councils. I don't know what it was like for you, Andy, but certainly ours will have 2 or 3 people who will say, give us your 1, 2, 3. And I think that then translates into the way that council functions as well, in terms of having groups of people who have demonstrated their willingness to work together and realising that they're not in danger of splitting the vote or disadvantaging themselves by lifting others up with them. And I think it's taken our candidates a while to get the hang of that, but now they use that really effectively, and it translates, as I said, it translates really nicely into a much more collaborative approach to campaigning. And as a result, I think, not that we don't have our factions within the DCC, but certainly you've got groups of people who are willing to be working together. And the Greens have certainly had a couple of really good, goes at campaigning and having people elected. And I think our recent mayoral campaign was a really interesting example of communities learning about the difference an electoral system makes, because of course our incumbent mayor had stood down, so the race was wide open, and there was a lot of concern amongst voters who were still thinking a little bit first past the post about how they could vote so they didn't split the vote, because it was quite a opinions were very divided over who would be the better mayor between 2 front-running candidates, and there were a lot more sort of left of centre options, and a number of us kept saying, you cannot split the ticket. Stop listening to other mayoral, because there's a lot of that Auckland talk that comes through with concern about that. Yeah. And people saying, what are we going to do? Who should we vote for? We shouldn't, we need to make sure that we don't allow somebody to sneak through the middle. And we were all saying, you can't do that. It is completely different. Just vote honestly and it'll all work itself out. Whoever hits the 50% quota has got the mandate to be mayor, and that'll be who gets elected. And I think seeing that experience play out in Dunedin was again another good opportunity for Dunedin to see, despite the fact that one candidate led for 11 iterations, the person who became mayor got passed in the 12th and had the mandate to lead. So I think again that was a good opportunity for Dunedin to see and feel confident that the person with the majority had been elected. So yeah, I do think I think that campaigning style is changing. I think the electoral system matters. It does make a difference to who gets elected, which is the point. And I think people are catching up with that fact and feeling much more confident about it.
Fantastic. Now, look, thank you, Janine and Andy and David. We didn't have a set time, but we do have to clear out of the town hall here. So I think that's probably as good a time as any to thank you and to wrap up. This has been fabulous. It's a first for us to have some video that we can now shoot off to London and say this is if you celebrated, we certainly were going to. Yes. Thank you so much, and I look forward to continuing the exploration as to how best STV can be advanced. And I personally totally agree that it needs to be handled by central government. It's just too painful. It's going to take too many centuries for all the councils to the way we're going. I mean, what do we have? 7 out of 44, was it? Or was it 74? I can't remember even the numbers now, but yeah, we've got to do so much better. So thank you so much. We would love to have shown you a Warkworth Town Hall with some of the crowds we've had, but the biggest crowd we had was on a very negative issue. So that's
always the way.
Exactly. That was a lot of fun. Not at all salubrious. It was the result of a lot of misinformation and troublemaking. So I much prefer the how many are we? 3, 6, 7. we didn't make the dozen, but it served the purpose. Thank you so very much, including the publicity that the local paper gave this event. So a lot of the town hall talks have, in fact, the most powerful one yet had about this number of people, and it resulted in $1 million Greenland mussel reef restoration project over 5 years involving 2 PhD students. So size doesn't matter in this instance. So thank you again so much, Janine, Andy, and
pleasure. Thank you, and happy birthday, STV.
Happy birthday.
I'll let you do the honors.
Thank you.
Bye bye. Thank you so much.
Bye now.
Cheers. Thanks. Have a good day.
See you.
You too.
Thanks, Andy and David. See you.
Cheers and have a good Christmas.
Yeah, you too. Bye now.
Bye.